Good evening, everyone. I'm Sam Barnes from NYT Live, which includes the New York Times signature conversation series, Times Talks. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's event, Time Talks, the Seattle Startup Engine, featuring 4 of Seattle's leading tech entrepreneurs and investors. They will explore how this city's startup ecosystem is currently poised for unprecedented acceleration of new company creation. This is our very first Times Talks in Seattle, and we couldn't be more thrilled to start things off with this topic and these great minds. I want to give a special thanks to tonight's presenting sponsor, Deloitte. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Don Heisler, Audit Partner for Emerging Growth Companies and Chair of the Deloitte Technology Fast 500 program for Washington State.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Don Heisler, and as I said, I'm an audit partner with Deloitte and work with many of the region's early growth tech companies. Thank you for joining us this evening. We at Deloitte couldn't be more pleased to have Seattle and the Puget Sound region recognized for what many of us have known and celebrated for decades. Gates, Schultz, Bezos, Senegal, Nordstrom, Allen, Boeing. This list represents just a few of the individuals who founded and created iconic companies right here in our own backyard. Grunge music, The 12th Man, Blown Glass, the first Stanley Cup winner, the first shopping mall, down-filled jackets, the center of electronic gaming, modern flight, defibrillators, compact discs, electronic toothbrushes, the first female mayor, the first living building, mobile phones, modern skis, and of course, the cloud. These are just a few of the products, services, and experiences the Puget Sound region has brought to the world. And today's Times Talk is entitled The Seattle Startup Engine. And tonight we'll discuss how and why the Puget Sound region has become a thriving ecosystem for entrepreneurs, scientists, financiers, real estate developers, businessmen and women, and more importantly, dreamers. At Deloitte, we're honored to be a part of this ecosystem and are pleased to be a sponsor of tonight's event, where we all can celebrate what I can best characterize as home.
Please welcome to the stage moderator Karen Weise and panelists Hattie Partovi, CEO of Code.org, Amy Nelson, CEO of The Riveter, Glenn Kelman, CEO of Redfin, and Dan Lewis, CEO of Convoy.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming for the first Times Talk in Seattle. We're super excited to be here and to have this great panel. It was kind of like our dream panel when we were thinking about how to do this first event and really talk about the tech, the growth of tech here, the culture, what people are thinking about, what it's like to be a tech company now in this city, in this country, in this fundraising environment, all of it. So I can do quick intros again. We're excited to have Hadi, who is, I don't know how to describe Hadi, like the godfather of angel investing in Seattle or something,
Wow,
also running Code.org. Amy Nelson, lawyer turned, and political fundraiser turned entrepreneur with The Riveter. Many of you have been in her spaces and part of her network. Glenn Kelman, who started with Redfin a while ago as CEO and took it public a couple of years ago. And then Dan Lewis, who started Convoy after stints at Amazon and Microsoft. So 2 founders, well, founder also, but in the past, investor and a public company CEO. We want to show some of the range that we have here. And I thought we would start with Hadi. We were chatting about what Seattle was like when you moved here as an intern at Microsoft and what it's like now, and kind of, I thought it might be helpful just to kind of chart a little bit of the change and what you saw when you first came here, what kept you here and brought you back, and what it's like now. And we'll go from there.
Sure. This was in 1991, was my first summer internship at Microsoft. Back then, I remember, first of all, the Bellevue Square Mall was a one-story sort of set of shops. You kind of just drive up to the store you wanted. And Microsoft was the main company in town. This is before Google even existed, before the tech boom, and it was at a time when technology in general was a world where IBM was the big company and Microsoft was the upstart, recently public company that was trying to establish itself. And in the region, this wasn't a tech region. It was, Boeing and a bunch of other sort of older companies, and it was just getting started. And throughout the 90s, as Microsoft grew and grew, the Seattle region still ended up being just a whole bunch of little companies in the shadow of one big one. And I remember even throughout the Bay Area, even the idea was if you're going to build a company, the exit would be selling to Microsoft. That was basically your one path. It's incredible how now we have two of the world's largest companies are based here, but also pretty much every single Bay Area tech company has an outpost here. And that makes a major difference in terms of attracting talent and keeping talent in the area. Because somebody who majors in computer science or wants to go into tech can start a company. Their company can get acquired not only by Microsoft or Amazon, but by Google, Facebook, Twitter, Salesforce, Apple, SpaceX. You name it, every tech company has a presence here, so you can end up working at them, or you can sell your company to them, which then actually expands the universe of exits and therefore the attractiveness of starting a company in the Seattle area as well.
And Glenn, you're from here, right? Hometown. And then what was it like kind of picking up in the middle of that trajectory and Redfin being kind of earlier than like this new era of startups?
Well, I went to school in the Bay Area. I remember I got to know Hadi there, and then I came back to Seattle about 15 years ago. And at the time, the rain really affected me, and I wasn't sure you could build a technology company here. And at some point, my wife confronted me, and she said, well, if Bill Gates could do it, and if Jeff Bezos could do it, it must be possible. And now I think it's the best possible place to build a company. It's obviously the best place to live. It's this wonderful wilderness around a beautiful city. But I think many technology companies that thought they could only exist in San Francisco as recently as 5 years ago are now extremely aggressively looking to diversify, looking to get out of town because it is so expensive, it is so competitive, there's a different mindset. People leave jobs every 18 months, and here in Seattle I still think people have more loyalty to a business. They're in it for the long haul, they want to help you create something meaningful, and so I think this is the best possible place to run a company and to build a company.
And Amy, what was it like to start? I mean, you moved here.
I moved here in 2012. I was an Amazon trailing spouse, which is like the least unique Seattle story ever at this point. In fact, I was actually a trailing girlfriend at that time, but now a spouse. And when I moved here, I didn't know very much about Seattle. But I can tell you from 2012, when I moved here to today, even just in that short period of time, the city has changed so much. And I was a lawyer when I moved here and thought I would be a lawyer forever. Until I decided to take the easy path and start a company. But I think, when I started the company, I knew very little about the startup ecosystem anywhere, let alone in Seattle. But what I can say about Seattle, now that I've been in this world for a few years and been around the country and talked to people in different cities starting companies, is that the ecosystem here is wildly supportive. I've met everyone on the stage before. I've had dinner with Glenn, and I don't think if I lived in San Francisco that I would be having dinner with public company CEOs a year after I started my little company. And I think that's really remarkable, and I think it's something that we have to hold on to as we continue to grow.
How did you crawl in? I mean, telling me about scrolling GeekWire.
Oh, yes.
A small circle means you got to get into that circle.
Well, so when I started the company, and decided that I would build the Riveter as a nationwide company instead of something just in Seattle, I knew I needed to raise money, but I didn't really know how. And I didn't know anybody who invested in companies. And so being very savvy with research as a lawyer, I decided to go onto geekwire.com and kind of Google names of angel investors. And I started an Excel spreadsheet of different names of angel investors. And then I went onto LinkedIn and found out if I had second or third connections to them. It was a very methodical, this is how I'm going to get lunches and coffees with all of these different people.
And then Dan, how about you? You also, Seattle.
I grew up in Seattle. I went to Inglemoor High School, yeah.
There we go.
I actually grew up by the Northgate Mall about a mile north of Northgate.
Get a
Both
run-in
of you
with the
guys are
mall
mall
rats.
rats.
Yeah. Actually, it's funny, we're talking about remembering the city. I remember Bellevue not having anything. And I remember when I was just after I graduated from high school, my friend was like, yeah, there's this condo building going in this place called South Lake Union, and I'm going to buy it. I was like, why would anybody ever want to live in South Lake Union? I was like, and I'm from Northgate. So things are a little bit different now. I think I walked through there after, I worked at Amazon for a while and left. And just 2 years later, I was kind of walking back through the heart of it, in a different street I hadn't been on in a while, and I didn't recognize it. So the city's continued to evolve. I thought it was an amazing place to start a company. I was part of a different startup that ended up selling to Google, and a lot of folks moved down to San Francisco through that transaction. And I wanted to stay in Seattle. I felt like it was a better place to raise a family. I thought it was an amazing place to find loyal, kind of committed employees a little bit maybe further along in their career that were, really, really knowledgeable and had really deep experience. And finding a bunch of those folks in Seattle was actually pretty straightforward. And I think in the Bay Area, there's nothing wrong with starting a company down there, but you're caught up in the hype. There's the echo chamber. There's a lot of pressure to be involved in every event, every day, and everything. And people are asking you, and you have to make up a reason you can't go in Seattle. It's like, well, I live in Seattle, so I can't come down. And so you can stay out of the rat race a bit and stay focused. So it's been good.
We were chatting before, someone was saying Seattle doesn't have as much swagger as the Valley. And I think that's objectively true. Is that good? Is that bad? Do we need more swagger in the city? Maybe that's the wrong word to use, but it's...
I will say, I don't think we need more swagger. I think it's something that makes Seattle very special. It's one of the reasons it's also fun to build a company here because there's just great people to work with. Not that people in the Valley aren't great, but it's different. But I will say, our ecosystem has grown a lot, and I'm still very much in the early stage. The Riveter is we're not 3 years old yet. The funding ecosystem here has not grown to keep a pace with, I think.
What? There's so much money.
Here?
There's so much money.
It's so hard to hear from the female founder's perspective when we get 2% of it.
No. It's just every San Francisco VC is making trips up here every week saying, just please hook me up with your deals. When I hear founders say that,
Yeah.
We had a hard time raising money when we were in Seattle.
Yeah.
I understand that maybe it's because we were in Seattle, but I think Redfin's challenge was that it was a tough VC deal, that it was the kind of business that was going to take a long time, that was going to have to go public, that wasn't going to get acquired. But I still think that almost every Bay Area VC is looking to fund Seattle companies. I don't think it's a function of where you are. It may be sexism,
So
it
it's-
may be something else, but it isn't a function of location.
But I wish there were more VCs based here.
That's certainly true.
I
There's
think
not that
that
many
it's-
based here, or not nearly as many.
I think they are interested. I'm not going to say the name of one of the maybe top 5 or 10. Someone I know just joined there in the Bay Area as a partner, and they were kind of in a meeting, and the discussion was, we're only going to invest in Bay Area companies now. Just too much work. It's like, oh, that's an interesting perspective. I'm not saying that's normal. I was fortunate. I actually met different folks, and I did similar things to Amy in terms of keeping lists and really kind of being really thoughtful about tracking who I could potentially partner with in the future to build a company or raise money. And I knew Hadi. I actually met Hadi through a startup I was at called Wavy. Adrian Noonan had started this company, and I think Hadi helped me get access to a broader set of investors in that network that would have been really hard to access living in Seattle at the time, without a conduit to get in there and get access to some of the Silicon Valley investors as well. We raised both from Silicon Valley and Seattle, but I don't think that they're not interested. I think it may be harder just to find someone in that ecosystem.
I admittedly, like Redfin, have a business that is not your typical SaaS business, right? But I just think that I wish there were more VCs based in Seattle because those are the people you get to know the best, right? They're the people you spend time with. And Madrona Venture Group led our Series Seed, which is an amazing investor and has been an incredible partner to the Riveter. But when I look at a Series B down the road, I don't think there's any VC that is living in Seattle that could lead a Series B. And that's hard, right? I think
it's always hard to get someone to give you millions of dollars.
it is. And it should be. And it should be. And it should be, to be fair.
But It sometimes works in your favor to not be from the Bay Area because you can say, I'm coming down. Do you want to meet?
There's a
And
forcing.
they have 2 days where you're available. And for us, the problem was never getting the meeting, it was getting the money. That they understood what we were about, and they said no and broke my heart.
Let's talk about, because we're talking about funding now. What is it like in this moment? This is kind of, I'm curious how the kind of macro funding environment is playing out here. We hear, you know, I'm sure you hate WeWork, as do a lot of people. You know, this kind of realization of, you know, growth versus profit. What are you guys seeing, hearing? And Glenn, I'm curious from you because you're kind of in the public world, probably have different pressures, or probably didn't have the same exuberance potentially. I don't know. I'd be curious. But anyways, anyone?
Well,
On the spot.
I think, first of all, it's very different for enterprise companies. So if you're a software company that's selling to other businesses, I still think there's a very healthy market for that. But consumer companies have to compete with Facebook and Google or acquire customers from Facebook and Google, and the costs of that can be prohibitive. The performance of Uber and Lyft and many other companies on the consumer side that have tried to go public have been mixed. And so I think it's gotten very hard, and investors are really focused on profit. Maybe a year and a half ago, it really felt like public company investors were divorced from their private counterparts, that venture investors were funding growth, and then they'd send a company out into the public markets to get annihilated because the public investor is much more focused on profit. And now I think those points of view are converging. I think Hadi would probably know more than I do about sort of the venture perspective versus the public company investor perspective. But I just heard public company investors feel that the venture investor was out of touch 18 months ago, and now I think they've converged.
A lot of that is also due to the SoftBank Vision Fund. I mean, you highlight WeWork, but when you have one gigantic investor writing enormous checks like that, it causes every VC who thinks, oh, I don't want to miss out on the next deal. Everybody was
And other large VCs trying to raise not the same, but much larger funds.
Yeah,
So they could do
VCs
much
that had
larger
raised
deals.
$200 or $500 million funds are trying to raise $3 billion funds just to compete with a tiny fraction of SoftBank. And I think that whole house of cards is busy falling down, which I think is very helpful. It may be a little bit harder to raise money, but it also means you have fewer irrational competitors that are just sort of spraying money around competing with you. So.
Well, if this is, if kind of enterprise, slightly less growth-obsessed companies is where is a little safety now, that bodes well for Seattle relative to, is that fair or no?
I think so. When we were having lunch, I said something very, I don't know if it surprised you, but I basically thought a recession, which is somewhere around the corner at all times, would help this region in many ways. Because if you look at some of the companies here, like a recession obviously hurts all companies, but which are the companies that hurts most are the ones that are sort of way ahead of where they should be, is kind of ahead of their skis. Like in a recessionary environment, Amazon would be well ahead of its competitors at the tail end of that recession. You know, at the front end, nobody wants it, but 3 years later, who survived the best?
They don't even have Cokes in the fridge.
Or Convoy, similarly. Again, we don't want a recession, but Convoy's market advantage is the efficiency it can bring to trucking. So in the world of everything tightening up, when everybody needs to save money, they'll look for what's the most effective and most efficient way to do things.
Sometimes I think, oh, go ahead, Dan.
I was going to say, I think there, to your point earlier, I think also companies that are able to focus on, that are building services for businesses, oftentimes, and Seattle has a lot of those. Seattle's overweighted on the B2B side and the enterprise-focused side. And, you know, oftentimes looking at companies that have an established existing need for a service and then trying to build a better solution for that is something that I think Seattle does more than the Bay Area as a ratio, which is an advantage here.
Why do you guys think, so if you look at the various rankings of fundraising, of kind of size of the startup community, Seattle's often fifth, right? There's like Bay Area, New York, LA, Boston, and then Seattle. And it's kind of actually a sizable gap, typically. Why is it, so A, it's not the fifth largest city, so it's pulling its, you know, pulling above its weight, whatever that phrase is, but also punching above its weight, thank you. But also, what is it that will pull it up more? What's lacking, or what are the missing pieces? I mean, maybe it sounds like larger round, funding for larger rounds. Are there other things that kind of would help pull it up? I think sometimes here, because there's so much tech work broadly, people feel like there's the startup scene to match it, and I think we just have these two huge companies that employ a lot of tech people too.
I first of all think looking at the money being put in is the wrong way of measuring. It's the market cap of the value created is the right way of measuring the value of a tech ecosystem. And having the number 1 and number 4 largest companies in the world should make Seattle number 2 after the Bay Area. If you just go by market cap of tech stuff. The other thing I'd say is the talent pool here, the number of software engineers or just tech employees here is a very, very unique asset. And that's why so many Bay Area tech companies build their offices here. And that's a different type of startup. The Facebook Seattle office that started out with 1 person and now is thousands of people. Each of those is, at least within the city's economy, is adding to the city economy. It's adding to the tech ecosystem, even though it doesn't have a venture capital funding round.
Do you ever wonder, Hadi, if we are the victims of Amazon's success? Because when I was starting out in technology, Oracle had this meteoric rise, and then it sort of came back to earth and everyone left. And there was this cycle of creation and destruction that spun out a lot of companies. But Amazon is just creation upon creation upon creation. And I think it's really hard to leave Amazon because the people who have stayed have become so wealthy. So I've sometimes wondered about whether...
A lot of them are at Convoy now.
You should ask. I'm trying to draw attention to that. I mean, in the last, if you look at the valuation, like many public companies have had incredible valuation increases over the last 5 years. And
but
so
they're 25.
No, I recognize that. But even if you look at their growth in the last 5 years, it's exaggerating the point you're making, which is, historically you're looking at kind of comparative growth rates of companies. And I think Amazon has grown extremely fast. And many publicly traded technology companies in the last 5 years have, which I think puts more pressure on other companies to not only have like a financial return in terms of why you should come work there, but also like a culture and a mission and things that really matter. And so, there will be times when the market runs up and a lot of public companies will look like they're going up really fast. Remember, I was interviewing somebody, I was trying to make them an offer, get them to join Convoy, and they were doing a comparison between what they thought the expected value of Convoy would be and the expected value of Amazon. And I think they were doing the math, and they were like, well, Amazon's going to be about $8.5 trillion in a few years. And I was like, oh, that's not how it works. Like, the curve doesn't actually look like that forever. It's not going to be, maybe if it's $8 trillion in 3 years, then I was wrong. But it was just so, I was like, A, let's get past that, but B, like, let's look beyond just that and think about the experience you get to have in your life. What are you going to think about when you wake up in the morning and go to work? Who are you going to get to work with? Are you going to feel passionate and excited about the ownership you have and the vibe in your office and just the culture? And I think we have to focus on that, and that's really where we can also differentiate as an ecosystem, as a community, relative to much more established companies, is you not only get to have a cool job, you get to create the story. Like you're writing and drafting and creating this culture and the story as you're working. And that's a really fun, unique experience in life. And I think that's why people should be in startups that are interested in that, not just for the other parts of the return.
Yeah, it is really remarkable to get to take an idea and build it with a team of people around you. And I know the people that, the Riveter now has, I think, 68 employees. And everyone is involved in everything that we're doing because we're still so early that everyone kind of gets to be a utility player on a really exciting team. And that's both challenging and fun. And it's necessary to want that part of your life because we have such a successful tech ecosystem, the competition is very high in terms of hiring. Our unemployment is very low. Amazon pays very well, so does Microsoft, so I've heard. And so, we're up against this, and at an early stage, equity is a big piece of a startup employee's compensation package, and it's a bet. Like you're taking a big bet that you hope will pay off. And as the founder, you believe that it can and drive the company toward that, but everyone who's signing on to do it with you is taking the same bet. And I think too, in terms of our ecosystem and how we can continue to grow, there's a lot of exciting things happening here that are helping all of us start companies and grow our companies. We have so many great accelerators, from Techstars to the Female Founders Alliance, Ready, Set, Raise program, and there's just so many resources, which is really remarkable.
Essentially, when I was talking with everyone before the panel, every single one of you individually, when we had our conversation to prep, brought up trying to talk about or think about the culture you're forming at your own companies, the questions your employees are asking of you that you maybe didn't anticipate. It's a moment of activism nationally. It's a moment of activism in the city. And I'm curious how that's playing out with your employees. Was it what you expected? And then how do you navigate that as you build your business at the same time?
Well, it's really fraught for me. Redfin is a mission-driven company, and the reason we've been able to recruit people to work at Redfin who could have gone to Amazon or Microsoft or Google or Facebook and earned more money is because we have this idea that we want to redefine real estate in consumers' favor, and I really believe in that. But once you attract people who are very mission-driven, there are other causes that are really important to them, but as the company grows, there are people who voted for Donald Trump and people who voted for Hillary Clinton who work at Redfin. There are people who are going to vote for one candidate or another in the next election. And I've just become more cognizant of the idea that the platform I'm standing on was built by people who have many different views. And there's something narcissistic about standing up for my political beliefs when it isn't necessarily theirs. But at the same time, I sometimes feel like a coward because you are given a stage. You do have your own convictions, just like every person does. And you try to be true to the mission of the company and avoid talking about topics that are well beyond that. And the employees try to redefine the scope of what the company stands for to encompass many more issues that you may personally really care about. But you want to be true to everyone who works there, not just to your own personal convictions.
I'm curious. Sorry, you're going to say.
Culture is hard, and building a company is really hard. And the Riveter is also a mission-based company, and we want work to look different for women. But that is it's a big hill to climb. And the Riveter is, on the company side, about 75% women. And I want the work experience at my company to be different than it is in corporate America for women. I mean, there are a lot of companies that are doing a great job with women employees, and we still have a pay gap, and women are still less likely to be promoted than men. There are still more Fortune 500 CEOs named John than there are women CEOs, and separately named James. So, like, there's some issues here that we have to work on. And the point of what I said to Glenn earlier about the 2% of VC funding going to women, like, there just aren't many startup CEOs who are women. And so, it's a rare place to stand. I have a platform. How do I use it to try to benefit everyone and meet the growth demands of an early stage startup, right? And so, we try to be forward thinking in our policies. Just this past week, we released pay bans to all of our employees. And it was a hard decision. A lot of advisors told us not to do it, but pay transparency is really important to pay equity. And if we're going to stand in this place and say that work should look different for women, we have to walk the talk. And so, there's that, and we have 16 weeks of paid parental leave. And of course, when I did that, I was like, not everyone will get pregnant at once. Actually, I think I have like 5 pregnant employees now, which is great, but I have 68 people. That's a lot of pregnant people. And someone's pregnant with twins. But I am a working mother of 4 little girls. And so this is really important to us that we do it this way. But it's hard. It's really hard.
Yeah, I think we think about kind of 3 things. One is, clearly, Amy mentioned a lot of people are joining a startup getting equity, and then there's a potentially big financial payout from that. And I think Convoy, obviously, I believe Convoy is going to be wildly financially successful, and I think there's an incredible financial opportunity. And that's like something that matters, and that helps motivate people and help people make decisions for their families to come join a company like Convoy. But then you look at culture, and it's kind of 2 parts. You have the mission of the company, which is when you're having you're going to have good days and bad days. And sometimes the day-to-day culture is going to be great, and it's sometimes going to bug you. But like the overall mission can ground you, and it's long-term, and it's like that evergreen North Star mission, you set. And then you think about how are we going to solve that over a long time and improve the world and improve a lot of things by doing that. And then you have the day-to-day culture. And that's like the values you live by as a company. That's like the principles and priorities and the mechanisms you set up and the things that kind of represent why someone wants to enjoy their time there and the community you build. And I think those are all really important, but those last two are kind of different. And I think we've tried to think about them both separately. Like, what is that long-term North Star? And then how do we make it so people, I work there, right? I want to go to a place every day that I like being, and I really want to like the people I work with. So like, how do we set that up? And I think that last one can be really hard because it's tiring and taxing and requires a huge amount of ongoing effort. And I think that's the one that gets to be the most challenging for companies.
How much is that what people are asking about when they're looking to join? You spend a lot of time recruiting people for senior leadership roles and stuff.
I don't know if it's the first thing they ask about, but I think it's one of the things that helps differentiate Seattle. When you guys were both talking about loyalty, when you think about loyalty, that's really from the employer's perspective, where you want loyal workers. Employees don't think, will I join a company as a loyal person? They're either motivated by growth or money or the mission. And I think our region is attracting more mission-oriented workers. And this is actually a real change relative to maybe 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I remember saying that, I'd looked at sort of the major US cities and I used to think, New York is about money and DC is about power and LA is about fame, but San Francisco is about changing the world and mission-driven technology invention. Nowadays, San Francisco has kind of become a mix of money and fame and power. Like all those other bad things combined have changed San Francisco, and I think Seattle really has taken the helm of being one of the places where people actually think more about in terms of mission-driven work. And I think that's what's causing a lot of what you call as loyalty from an employer standpoint, is about employees being committed more to the company for its mission. And I think that's going to help our region quite a bit.
The role of tech in the region and the city has been very angsty. I don't know what other word to use for the past couple years now. The head tax fight, the election was very intense. I mean, the amount of money in the past city council election. And I'm curious, there's obviously concern over, Glenn, you study housing and affordability as part of your business. I mean, there's real fears around this. So how does Seattle maintain that? What is the role of maintain this kind of groundedness? And what is the role of, is a problem for like the Amazons and Microsofts of the world to deal with? Or is this something that you guys think about in your businesses? I have to imagine it affects the pay you have to pay, things like that.
We think about it all the time. When I first came to Seattle, what I really liked about it was that you'd go into a coffee shop or a restaurant and you met people who weren't in technology, whereas in San Francisco sometimes it can feel very insular. And now I think there's really been a transformation of the city into a technology-driven city. There may be people working at Weyerhaeuser and Boeing and other companies, but most everyone here seems to work for Amazon or Microsoft, and it's created some anxiety about the identity of the city. But what's different to me about Seattle as compared to San Francisco is I still think there's a consensus that we can compromise and get something done. The head tax failed, but it looks as if another tax is going to replace it. And what I saw when I was in San Francisco is just a real deep sense of gridlock. That there is...
Yeah, if you think there's angst here, San Francisco is like toxic dysfunction, political system, just complete failure.
I actually think San Francisco is, and I know you do too, is a beautiful messianic place. I think the people who work there are very mission-driven. But I do think the politics there are more difficult. Some of it's the way the state of California is set up and the number of ballot initiatives. Some of it is just the history of San Francisco itself. But Seattle is filled with cranes. And many of those cranes are building office space for Amazon, but many of them are building housing. And if you look at the skyline of Seattle versus San Francisco, Seattle is really changing very fast. And we are building more housing for people. And that has limited price growth. Homelessness declined in its rate of growth over the past 12 months because rents moderated. And I still think that if we build more housing and we become a more dense city, that we can still be an affordable city. And people are leaving Seattle for Portland and Austin and Denver and Dallas because of affordability problems. So it's the most urgent issue the city faces, in my view. And I think it's handling it reasonably well.
I sometimes look at it, and I think we are handling it pretty well and getting better at it. And I sort of look at it as some of the challenges that we have faced over the past 10 years are much of the same challenges that high growth startups face. We have to adapt and grow and change as we're growing really fast, and the city grew very fast.
How is it you have locations in a bunch of different cities?
Ben just listed them all, actually. He really did. We're in Portland, Dallas, Austin, Denver, LA, yeah.
What feels different here versus there? Are there things that you wish this region could poach from other regions, kind of ideas, or that you take and want to bring back into the culture here?
Well, I think the interesting thing, and to speak to what Glenn really just said, is that like Seattle has moved into this newer stage where it is a bigger city and dealing with kind of more big city problems. And Austin and Portland and Denver are still kind of in that earlier growth stage where Seattle might have been a decade ago. And so the communities feel smaller, they feel closer. You have San Francisco on the other extreme. And just very accessible, I think would be the big difference.
I was thinking about growing up here, and it's different when you grow up here because you don't really know what anybody else's perspective is of you, but like at least remember hearing people talk a lot about how we felt like an underdog, and you kind of have a chip on your shoulder a little bit, and you're like, no, our sports teams are good too, and like we all felt like Doug Baldwin. It's like this constant feeling of a little bit of angst and not really getting the respect we deserve, and and being really proud and impressed when Seattle would get on the map for more things. And I think at some point in the last few years, I was kind of like, it definitely doesn't feel like that now. It definitely feels like Seattle's in the spotlight. And so I think that two things. One, if you have grown up here and you have, I have a pretty big family. Very few people in my family are in tech. And so, I've seen a lot of perspectives and a lot of people not as excited about all of the changes in Seattle and the way that sort of maybe it's worse in the Bay Area, but they haven't experienced that yet. So they're like, wow, it seems really dysfunctional. Like the city doesn't seem to care about people that live here or like the neighborhoods outside of the tech corridor. And so I think that there is a feeling like that. And I think though that also now that we're more in the spotlight, it sort of behooves us to come together and work on these things because we now have a bigger opportunity to attract another level of talent, another level of growth for this city, and we can influence more, and there's just more responsibility. But I think we've ascended to like a different kind of city over the last like couple decades. Or descended, I guess, but ascended I think is the right way to say it.
Yes.
Let's go.
I have one other comment because we've recently opened a Dallas office for engineers, and the most immediate reaction you would have if you walked into that office is that it's visually different because it's about 30% black. One of our challenges has been diversifying our engineering team. It's diverse in terms of gender, but racially Seattle is still one of the whitest places in the world. I think that's changing some, but when you walk into our Dallas office, it really feels different.
Seattle isn't, corporate Seattle is. So
there are not many African Americans here, and when you try to recruit African Americans, they fly in and tour neighborhoods, and they say, I'm going to stay in Atlanta, I'm going to stay in Dallas. I think that's still a challenge. You don't think that?
I was just going to say Seattle is racially more segregated. In other words, it's not only more white, but it's also more segregated. So
that's true. That's true. The other thing about Texas that's interesting, I have sort of a grudge against Texas. My family left Texas when I was 10 to come to Seattle, and we felt delivered. But Texas has this sense that California had when I went there in the 80s and the 90s, that the future happens here first and that we own the future. There is a cockiness to that place right now, that everyone is moving here, that this is the way America is going to be. And it feels strange to visit there and say, oh, Houston is this really dynamic, exciting place. Dallas has become this hub in a way that I never thought. I thought of it as like the home of JR, the guy on the mini-series or TV show, but it's sort of having a renaissance that's larger than Austin, Texas, which is where most tech companies go.
If you guys had your magic wand, if you could change one thing about either your business or the city or the region, what would it be?
Somebody go first. That's a hard question.
I'll give the first answer, which probably would be maybe less interesting than some of the ones following. But I think commercial real estate in Seattle, and we're talking about expansion, it is extremely painful to find kind of great real estate options if you're a fast-growing company and you're in the same, I don't know, like area code as Amazon. And I think that, as you think about culture and you think about maintaining that and really building the right kind of experience for employees, the physical space that you're in and how you build that community and how you interact, it's not everything, but when you're headquarters and when you're trying to kind of to figure out who you are, it's really important. And I think that that's been a big challenge. And I think that I worry about, compromising those areas and not being able to have the right experience for the company because just finding space is so difficult and it gets taken so quickly by the massive companies that are here.
I feel like I have to say I wish we made more money. But other than that, I feel like I have to say that for our investors and for everyone else.
Yeah.
But the issue that I think about that's probably more emotional is just, it's about culture, because I think you'll find even when you're very early stage, there are going to be people who say, I know we're 68 people now, but when we were 30, that was the real Riveter. Those are the original gangsters of Riveter. And there's these nostalgic people who want to trap the culture under amber or glass and make it a museum artifact. And I was there when Redfin was 3 people in an apartment. I was there when Redfin was 20 people. We were always worried we were going to run out of money, and we were very short-sighted about it because we had 2 months of cash. And I think our culture is better now than it ever has been. But I also ask myself, how would I know? Because as you get bigger, I worry that people are scared to tell me the truth, even though I try to make it easy. I worry that someone could have a great idea and it wouldn't be funded by the company. I look at the resumes of people we reject, and they look sometimes like me, and I want to make sure that someone who's got a lot of gumption and isn't totally diplomatic all the time can still shake things up. So I just feel really careful about getting nostalgic about a culture or even becoming preservationist about a culture when you have to believe that every year you can make things better.
I often look at things through a gender lens, which is not surprising. But I wish that there was more funding for women and other underrepresented founders, and that we saw more women and more underrepresented classes in leadership in companies. We bring diversity of thought to a leadership table. And the way I look at it is, if only 2% of funding is going to women, that means 98% of innovation dollars in this economy are going to ideas that men are coming up with. What could we do to change lives that would be driven by women? Because we're often driven to solve the problems in our own lives. I started the Riveter because I became obsessed with the fact, like the statistic in Lean In, that 43% of highly trained women off-ramp after they have kids. And when I read that footnote, I thought, if this is true, the system is broken, we all know it and we accept it. And if we try to tackle this problem, we would reshape the American economy. Right? And I'm very fortunate to have gotten funding, and a lot of it has to do with, I had a great business idea, I have a network, I'm privileged, I'm white, right? And so I wish that everyone had that access.
You're a badass. You read Geekwire and then looked them all up on LinkedIn.
I'm persistent. But I wish that we had more funding so that those, there are amazing ideas that never will see the light of day because they don't get the oxygen to start the companies.
I have 2 thoughts, one which is more limited to my sphere, and then one which is broader. One, relative to the work I'm doing at Code.org and education, I think not just in this region, but much more broadly, but especially in this region, if I could wave a magic wand and have every school teach computer science and have the University of Washington and all the universities have larger computer science programs, that would help not only our economy, it would certainly help the tech ecosystem. If real estate is hard to find for a company, talent is by far the hardest thing to find for any software company. And most of Seattle's companies are fighting over this limited pool of talent and trying to import talent, whereas homegrown students in Washington State have much less access to actually learn computer science. At the university level, UW rejects 3/4 of students who want to study computer science. They're told that's welcome to the University of Washington. You can major in anything you want except computer science. And it's the most hotly demanded. It's so much so that there's 2 admissions pathways to UW. The regular admissions and the CS admissions. You can apply to the university or you can apply to the CS department because it's in so much demand. So it's just capacity for teaching the subject, which is also not taught in the majority of our schools in the K through 12 level. And obviously that's the work that I'm devoting myself to, which is where I think first. But the other magic wand, if I could wave, would be frankly around divisiveness in our country's politics.
Yes.
I think.
Thank you.
Thank you for whoever clapped. Whichever candidate you support, there's some other candidate that you hate, and the candidate that you hate, whether it's on the right or the left, isn't just the candidate. It also represents an entire voting base of people that love that person, and so if I think of the candidates that least align with my values, candidates will come and go. The voters are going to stay. And the divisiveness of our country is not as easy as getting your candidate to win because those voters will still be there.
Yeah.
And getting our country to find common ground on things that we can agree on, I think, is critical to not just our city, but also our country moving forward.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Yeah. I feel like one of the things that you see in the world that obviously comes back to work as well is just assuming positive intent. And it's really hard to do that when you look at another group and you're like, I immediately assume negative intent for most things that are happening. And most people believe that they can feel empathy for someone else's situation. And that the negative of that is that you look at somebody else in a different situation that's different than yours and you're like, oh, I know what their real motivation is. I understand them. I can understand, what they're thinking and I can assume why they're doing this. And you can't really. It's super hard unless you've lived or walked in someone's shoes in some experience. And there's so many things I can't understand, that are so important in the workplace when it comes to hiring and developing talent across different diverse forms. Women in particular. I've learned a lot at Convoy about inherent bias and kind of things like that like I didn't understand until I was in this role, and I would see people's career paths moving, and I would see it being different here or different here, and I would see maybe a woman being described as being aggressive or pushy or bossy, and a guy being described as assertive and strong, and I'm like, but they're doing the same thing, and they're both really smart, and you sort of start to realize these things, and it's very easy when you're not living in that to believe you understand somebody, and then assume the intent when you're, and I think stepping back and just realizing you can't do that. It's impossible almost for a human to truly empathize and understand, to truly understand someone's experience if they don't actually live that person's experience. And once you recognize that, you can stop trying to believe you know how to do that, and you can just start listening and pulling it in. I think about divisiveness, so much of that is because it's like, I believe I know what that person is thinking. I believe I understand their motivation, so I'm going to typecast them immediately. And that's something I've just discovered and learned a lot more in this role, and I feel privileged now to get to see this, but it reminded me of that when you were saying that.
That's one of our corporate values, is assume best intent in communication, because we can tell ourselves all sorts of stories about why people are saying something or why they're trying to make X or Y happen. And when you just back up, and I've had to learn this, to take a breath and think, okay, I don't know why they wrote that way, but I have to assume the best intent, and you can move forward so much more quickly in business and in life with that attitude.
I think we have 15 minutes now for questions. There are folks with mics, and raise your hand. And we ask for questions, not statements.
Pronouncements.
First hand I saw is right over here.
Hi, my name is Rachel Klausner, and I have a question for Hadi. One of the first things you said was that the presence of like Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, being here is really conducive to startups because of the acquisition path. And there's been a lot of talk about breaking up big tech, breaking up Amazon, breaking up the Facebooks. I'm curious your opinions or your thoughts on if that would be a good idea, if that would help the startup community or harm the startup community by breaking up big tech and the subsequent acquisitions or talent or transparency that would elicit.
I'm not a fan of breaking up big tech. And I think about it less from the lens of would it help the startup community, more just is it the right thing to do? And as an example, for example, Facebook is probably one of the companies that is most looked at as for that people just dislike what has happened to our democracy and to our divisiveness of our communities, and they're a natural company to dislike. But if you break up Facebook into, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, you still have, each of them still has the same problems of filter bubbles and fake news and whatnot. The problems with Facebook aren't its size, it's things like fake news or the policies or whatnot. And a breakup wouldn't actually address the things you dislike. In
fact, it would make it worse.
It would
I just want
probably
to
make
speak
it worse
to
because
that.
they'd have fewer people. Each one of those companies would have fewer resources to attack those problems.
If you look at the smaller social media companies, their ability to monitor fake news, to handle trolls, to deal with all the sort of incendiary behavior is limited by their resources. But there's an argument for regulation.
Yes. Basically, there are problems with certain big tech companies, but the solution isn't breakup. In fact, in the Facebook case, it would actually make the problem worse. The solution needs to be some other form of regulation to solve the problem that is effectively hurting society in the way these companies operate.
And just one further thought on that is sometimes I wish that Mark Zuckerberg would take responsibility for arbitrating the truth of all statements. And then other times I feel very uncomfortable with the idea that he should have that power. And that's when you come back to the need for regulation, that it isn't Facebook's size, it's the fact that no private enterprise should be the arbiter of truth, that really the government should have a role in that. And I know that's
Data privacy and advertising is another type of issue
Right.
where breaking up companies won't address it. Creating privacy regulations will, which hopefully will happen over the next couple of years as there's been a growing momentum at the state level and there's now new momentum at the federal level. And those things will improve the things about big tech that I think hurt our lives the most. We're approaching a world where the next decade is going to see a tremendous sort of increase in attention about the regulation of tech. Technology has had a greater and greater impact on society to the point that at this point its impact is way ahead of where policies are.
Right.
And we're going to see much more of that. And as we go through that, we should recognize that the other change that's going to happen over the next 10 years is Chinese tech companies and other international tech companies being major competitors in our country. An app like TikTok is one of the first major social media apps that many of folks' kids use that is not managed out of the US, not regulated in quite the same way because it's made by a Chinese company. We've gotten used over the last 30 years that we create the tech and we export it to the rest of the world, not the other way around. And I think that's a point of national pride. It's a point of national economic, growth and might. If we break up our tech companies, they're going to be struggling relative to these multinational non-US companies that'll come in. And that's something to think about as well when you think about the sort of downsides of tech.
Hi, my name's Serene. I actually work for Convoy. And I have a question for Hattie, because I really loved your description of the different cities and the ecosystems, because I'm hopefully Talent that just moved from London, which has a very different startup ecosystem, far more fintech based. And I just wanted to kind of segue off the discussion you've just had and get your view on international cities, London, Singapore, Tel Aviv, what your view is of kind of their one word descriptor.
I am not an expert enough, and I'll have to pass on that question mostly. What I would say is great is how software has become much more global, and so many more companies have come on the scene, not just in China, which I mentioned, but from all sorts of other countries. And I think if you take a global view of the world and as a world citizen, it's great that in so many other countries, technology is creating opportunity for people to build livelihoods, and that's part of why the work I do with Code.org is to enable education pathways for students globally to get there. But I don't have magic one words for the other cities. I know the US much better than I do the rest of the world when it comes to tech. Somebody else may have ideas.
I don't.
Hi, this question is for Dan. You guys are set to change the trucking industry, and most of the people who work in the trucking industry are either lower middle class or working class people. How do you see the efficiencies or the gains that you gain through your industry being passed to them? Because we have such problems with income inequality, and you're set to really transform an industry where it's mostly working class people.
Yeah. So let me just give you, I'll start with a quick story, an example of a time that I kind of saw this firsthand. I've been on several different radio programs for different trucking shows. I think this one was called Raw Dog Trucking that I was on.
Raw dog?
Raw Dog Trucking. And it was great. But somebody called in, and I remember very clearly they were in Las Vegas, and they were calling a radio show saying, hey, I was wondering if you guys could find me a load. I need to get back east. I don't have a load to get back east right now. So they were at a point where they needed that to pay their gas to get back to where they needed to go. And they couldn't find a load because the industry is extremely fragmented. That person's options were to go online on a Craigslist-like experience and try to find someone who had a load going that direction. They would call them and find out after 10 calls that the load wasn't even available in the first place. They would try to call a few different brokers they know, and those brokers maybe know of a couple hundred loads, and maybe they have one going that direction. But this person couldn't find one, and so they're desperate. And it's kind of, for us, we can sit in our office and think about the algorithms and the technology that makes it all happen. For that individual person in that moment, it's kind of a do or die situation to get a job running back east, right? Otherwise, you're going to deadhead the whole way. And that's what we're doing. Like we're aggregating opportunities for truck drivers across hundreds of different companies, thousands of different loads into a single platform that can understand that person's need and offer it to them right there on the spot from their truck, right? So I can get into all the things about making them more efficient and all the ways we can help them with payments and reducing empty miles and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, there's a ton of opportunity, and I guarantee there were probably 100 jobs that this person could have taken in that direction that existed in the country, but they couldn't find them. And so we're helping them find jobs that are relevant to them by aggregating something that has been forever fragmented and broken.
It's one reason I'm proud to be on this panel. I think there's many tech companies that make software for affluent young men because the tech companies themselves are started by affluent young men. And I feel like Amy is serving an audience that hasn't always been served, and that Dan is serving an audience that hasn't always been served because most of the founders of tech companies just haven't had the experience of driving a truck or being a woman. So it's just a good feeling. It's a good thing.
Hi, my name's Dan Delmar. In the Seattle Startup Engine, how do you see the availability of mentors for startups before they get institutional capital to be able to find a great match between the founder and the mentor?
I thought Seattle was really friendly when I came here. I still remember that I called the CEO to ask for advice, and I thought we would go to Quiznos, and he took me to Carmine's, which is this old school Italian restaurant where they've got these ancient guys in tuxedos with crumb scrapers, and he spent hours with me, and it just felt like it was a little smaller and a little nicer and almost a Rotary Club feel where people try to help each other out. But I don't know if that was just my luck or if that's a common experience. But I thought Seattle is friendlier that way. I don't know, do you guys feel that way?
I had an incredible experience in finding mentors. I mean, truly, like when I joke about going on GeekWire and finding the names of angel investors, Hadi, I don't know how I didn't find yours. Totally. But I also, you know, in that journey, a lot of people that I met with didn't invest in the Riveter, but offered me advice and had coffee with me and took meetings. Karen Snyder, who's an amazing founder of Textio, you know, I called her out of the blue and she didn't have time to meet me in person, but she made time to have a 45-minute phone call with me once after 8 o'clock. And I remember now, you know, she's, I think, 3 years ahead of me in her journey, and I often think about her and I'm like, how the hell did she do that? And why? And it's just because that's our community and it's what we do for one another, which is really amazing. I mean, Glenn, like I had dinner with Glenn. Glenn spent time with me and 3 or 4 other female founders who are in the growth stage talking to us about where we were and what we needed. And like, things like that are just really transformative.
Free food.
It was great food and it was free, yeah. So.
Trying to think I think, you know, there's definitely investors that you can point to and say those people were interested in meeting, but that's, you know, also kind of their, it's a big part of their job. I think other CEOs was the thing that I was excited about spending time with, and I found that a lot of people in that role would spend time. I actually look at it now and I feel almost like bad, like I want to do that more.
Yeah.
I try to make time for it, and obviously those requests do come in sometimes, and I do it if I can. And I'm probably in a pretty busy stage, but I'm like, I almost feel like, man, they really must have cared. They put time and energy and they made time for this, right? Because now that I'm doing it, it's like very, very taxing, and there's not a lot of time. So I feel like from that perspective, knowing what they were probably dealing with and the fact they were making time to meet with me and help me understand things demonstrates that there are people in Seattle that are doing that.
And it's also worth noting, again, I mentioned this earlier, but we do have all of these resources here, like Techstars and the Female Founders Alliance, who make great connections. And it's worth showing up at the events and becoming a part of those communities. They're real. I've met a ton of founders through the Female Founders Alliance, and early on, that was really, really helpful to my growth.
Do we have time for one more? This one in the middle?
Hi, my name is Weise, and I just want to thank you guys for taking the time to do this today. My question is kind of centered around a couple essays that I've read by Paul Graham, and he makes this really staunch argument against, you know, whether or not it's possible to replicate Silicon Valley elsewhere. And there really is a difference between the energy in San Francisco. It seems like everyone and their mom is starting something. If you walk into a Phil's coffee shop, you'll overhear like really funny conversations. I'm curious to know whether or not you guys feel the difference in energy and what you're doing to stimulate that kind of irreverent entrepreneurial spirit that you see in Silicon Valley, and if that's something that we can have here in Seattle.
I just don't think you should ever try to replicate anything. I want to be Seattle instead of San Francisco. San Francisco has this amazing energy. It is this special place, and I love that place, but I love Seattle for different reasons. And so if you're trying to build a platform company like a Facebook or a LinkedIn, San Francisco is the best place. But if you were, say, trying to build a retail company, Nordstrom, Costco, Amazon, Starbucks, there's different DNA here that you can draw on. So sometimes when I hear about someone arguing that this is what we have to do to become Silicon Valley, I want to say, well, I never wanted to be that way anyway.
Also, a lot of Silicon Valley has Seattle envy right now for a number of different things. So again, the political angst that we talk about here is way less than it is in San Francisco. Our homelessness, the problems we feel, which are not good, they're bad, but are still way less bad than San Francisco. So, but there are things we can learn from in terms of the hustle that people have in San Francisco.
And Amy's right, the money. They do have
Money
a ton
helps.
of money.
But I will say, I also look at it this way, right? Like 3 years and 2 weeks ago, I was a corporate litigator with, at the time, 2 kids. And if I could leave after 10 years of doing that and start a company and be able to grow the way that we have, like this is the place to do it. this is an amazing city with a ton of opportunity.
Yeah, and it can be a hidden opportunity. I think if you were, to your point, if you were to look at people from around the country, around the world that were thinking, I want to go get involved in technology startups, and I'm going to move to go do that, they're probably going to move to the Bay Area, right? That's like the first thing they'd probably think of. But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a better community to build a startup in, and especially the kinds of startups that Glenn was talking about. And many of the startups that people don't know about, they're not named brands in the consumer sphere, but they can be extremely important, successful companies with great cultures and like that. They can be based here. And so I think it's different, and we can lean into our strengths, and I think it'll keep growing.
It's a big deal that the top and the fourth company in the world are based here.
Yeah.
It'd be, it's one thing, like if you think movies, you think Hollywood, but if the number one most top grossing movie and the number 4 top grossing movie were being made somewhere else, you'd start shifting. And I think that mindset shift is going to start happening. There's already companies moving out of San Francisco because of either the housing or the taxes or things like that.
Great. Thank you, guys. Thank you all. Thank you all.